laws. In the book on relativism, we have, I think we have 7 or 8 on the book that, that we go through to show why relativism is false as a view of morality. But I have to tell you how I'm going to argue here, because I'm arguing in a very particular way. I'm arguing using something that's called an intuition. Now, when I say intuition, I mean something particular. I don't mean like women's intuition or the ability that some people have when they're in a field for a long time to come up with a quick answer. If you're a doctor, you know, you've done it so often that you just kind of take a look at the circumstances and subconsciously all your learning comes to play and you come up with a diagnosis and it may be right because you're just good at this after learning. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a way of knowing something that you don't know how you knew it, a way of knowing that's built in. From a philosophical perspective, this way of knowing is right on the very bottom tier. You don't get to this knowledge by some other means. It's just there. For example, I say to you, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is moral. See? Now, how did you know that? I've done this dozens and dozens of times with different audiences, not always a stellar educated group like this here at UCLA, but just normal folk. And they come up with the answer. How did they know that? And if I pressed you on that, you would say, I don't know, you can just see it, right? You can just, if you know the meaning of the first 2 things, and that makes sense, then the other just follows. And if I asked you to prove that to me, that it follows, you would be at wit's end to do so, because you'd say, well, that is the proof. That if you don't see it, I don't even know how I get there if it's not obvious to you. Frankly, if I said that I didn't see that, you would probably think there was something wrong with me. Like, you know, come on, what is it? What's missing up there, right? If I said that Mary is shorter than Bob and Bob is shorter than Bill, what would I know about Mary to Bill? That she was shorter. Right, okay, so I gave you a little help because this is mostly undergraduates here, so I gave you some help. But you would have figured it out even if I hadn't done the visual, if you understand the words. Now, these are examples of, that's the transitive relationship, I think, right? These are examples of rational intuitions. These are things that you kind of got built in there and that operate without any justification. Now, I think there are not only rational intuitions, I think there are moral intuitions as well. They're moral intuitions that inform our behavior and inform our language, and they pop up all the time. My point simply here is, if these moral intuitions are misinformed, if there is no objective morality, then the things that inform our moral intuitions turn out to be nonsense. So we might say something like, rape is wrong. All right, and why would we condemn rape if we didn't have a moral intuition that rape is somehow morally objectionable? Actually so, not just to us, you know, but actually wrong in itself. And by the way, when I'm arguing the basis of moral intuitions, I don't really bear a burden of proof here. What I'm trying to do is appeal to something that I think you already know. And so I'm not going to prove, other than making this appeal to intuition, the points that that will follow. For example, if you told me, well, it's not clear to me that rape is wrong, my response is not going to be, well, I think you have an interesting alternate morality. My response is going to be, get help. I mean, something's wrong with you, it seems to me, if this is not a self-presenting moral principle. Now, I'm not just simply going to assert that, though. I think, by and large, you folks believe this. And this is what I meant by Christianity resonating, the principles and the worldview of Christianity and the view of Jesus resonating with our deepest intuitions about the world. Because I'm not trying to persuade you of this. I think you already believe it. And I think you believe it because of the way you talk about the nature of the world. And I'm going to give you some examples about the way you talk about things that evidence your deep commitment to objective morality. And this makes up the 7 fatal flaws or whatever. I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 of them. First of all, if a person is a relativist, he must surrender all language that pertains to moral wrongdoing. That is, a relativist can never say, that person did something wrong. Now, he might be able to say, I didn't like what happened. I wouldn't do that if I were him. It's not my cup of tea. But he could never offer a legitimate judgment on anyone else for anything being wrong. It would be like saying you broke a rule in a game that has no rules. You know, what if your game that you're playing has the whole earth, this is the whole earth, there's no boundaries. You say, hey, you're out of bounds. You say, what do you mean out of bounds? There's no boundaries in this game. By the same token, when you say there are no moral rules and then you claim somebody's wrong, that's like saying they've gone out of bounds in a game that has no boundaries. It's nonsense. And what's going to happen then is you're going to have to bite the bullet and acknowledge that people like Hitler and Pol Pot and Idi Amin and the rest of them were completely within their moral rights, as it were, to do whatever they preferred in the moment as long as they had the power to accomplish it. You couldn't say they were wrong, because wrong is violating a moral rule, and if your view is that there are no moral rules, you can't say they're violating them. Now you just have to ask yourself, friends, the question, does it seem like there are some things that it's appropriate to say, that's just wrong? I don't care what anybody says. That's just wrong. If you feel justified in virtue of your moral intuition to use the word wrong in that way, and by the way, everybody does, that's why they use it so often, then relativism must be false. Here's another flaw, and very few people have even thought about this. If relativism is true, you could never, ever complain about the problem of evil in the world. Now you think about that for a moment. One of the regular, probably the most tenacious objections to what Jesus believed is the objection of evil in the world. How could there be a good and loving God if there's all this evil in the world? Now, do you realize that the objection, first of all, it's a fair objection. I fully sympathize with it, and it needs to be addressed. And I think it can be. We have some teaching on it, and others have talked about it. I think Bill Craig was here, Dr. William Lane Craig was here last year, and he spoke on it as well. But there are answers to it. But what's interesting to me is that the question is raised at all. And what does it tell us about the nature of our beliefs about the universe if we raise the question? You Christians must be wrong because there's evil in the world, and you say God is good. And my first question is going to be, what is it? Can you help me out a little bit here and help me understand what it is that you mean by evil in the world? You see, for this objection to be sustained, to even be spoken, there's got to be evil in the world. There's got to be objective evil, not just our subjective preferences. You know, just about 2 years ago, I think almost this week, we had this ghastly shooting in Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. And 2 members of the Trenchcoat Mafia, high school students, came in at lunchtime, guns blaring, tossing pipe bombs left and right. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, 14 kids were dead. The two shooters had taken their life. A teacher was dead also. That happened on a Tuesday around noontime. The following Monday, I was at Long Beach City College in a debate on Christianity versus atheism. What do you think came up in the discussion? What was on the headlines of every newspaper around the country for that whole week? In fact, the LA Times headline in the Metro section said, "Where was God?" Now, it's interesting, given that response, and like I said, I'm sympathetic to that response. I understand how people can raise that question, but what is necessary to be in place for someone to legitimately raise that objection is a commitment to the idea that there is evil in the world, and this is an example of it. Because if there is no God and there is no morality, if relativism is the right way to look at it, there are a lot of things you could say about what happened in Littleton, Colorado in that spring of 1999. Oh, you could say that really upset me. I didn't like that. I wish it hadn't happened. I would never do something like that. You could talk about all these things that turn out to be reporting of personal autobiography. But one thing you could never say, if morals are relative, is that what happened at Littleton, Colorado was evil. You could never say it was wicked. And I don't know about you, but whatever you say about what happened in Littleton, Colorado, that's the one thing it seems we must say. And if we say that that was wicked and that was evil, or anything else like it, and there are many examples, then that objection can only make sense if morals are objective in some sense and relativism is false. Now you can go down the line. What about justice and fairness? Do we complain about the lack of justice in the legal system? Well, what is justice? Justice is a moral good, an objective moral good that we ought to obey. It's wrong to punish the innocent in virtue of his innocence and to let the guilty go free in virtue of his guilt. I mean, this is just obviously unjust, and this is why when we see things like that, the word injustice comes out of our mouth just like that. And many other words like them, because we are spontaneously making moral judgments about circumstances that we understand to have moral qualities to them. That's not fair. Well, if you're a relativist, this is nonsense. Because fairness is a moral good, a moral obligation. And if there are no moral obligations, then the word fairness not only is like wrong or false, it's incoherent. It doesn't point to anything. It's just like blabbity blab. You might as well just say that. Oh, that's blabbity blab. Because it doesn't have any more meaning. Now, why do we chuckle? Because we know that justice and fairness are not blabbity blab kind of things, right? That there is a moral intuition that we have about the nature of the world that is informing our language. And that if we hold to our relativism, then we must acknowledge that the language that we're using to describe all of these things is nonsense. And you can go right down the line. I said I had 8 of them. Here's one more. If you're a relativist, you cannot demand tolerance.